Coming up, NDN Collective is bringing attention to World Water Day with a report on the Dakota Access Pipeline. Plus, we explore the legacy of the late Congressman Don Young. And we'll learn about the Ontario Native Women's Association as we continue to celebrate Women's History Month. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amirawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. Yesterday, the National Congress of American Indians hosted a virtual town hall on the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. The town hall included a review of the tribal provisions in the law and next steps for tribal nations. This landmark act has been described as historic. Added to the law is a significant increase in resources for tribal nations to exercise their restored jurisdiction. During the event, Cherokee citizen and lawyer Mary Catherine Nagel pointed out that VAWA is not automatic for every tribal nation.
So your individual nation has to decide to implement VAWA. It's not something that just because this law is passed that every tribe is now exercising this jurisdiction. And if you take a close look at the legislation, there are specific requirements. Those are the same requirements that you'll find in the Tribal Law and Order Act that are sort of designed towards protecting a defendant's rights in tribal court.
These new tribal provisions do not go into effect for nations in the lower 48 states until October 1st of 2022. Community leaders, lawmakers, and citizens of Jemez Pueblo came together to celebrate a new beginning for the Toa language. Last week in New Mexico, construction for the Walatoa Early Childhood Learning Center broke ground. Funding for the center is estimated to be nearly $6 million. The language is currently taught to around 100 students ages 1 through 5 by fluent Toa speakers. At the event, students blessed the space with the butterfly dance. Gloria Sosi is a teacher at the Pueblo's Head Start. She said she hopes the new building will provide more classroom space for her students. In attendance was New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, as well as indigenous state lawmakers. And Jemez Pueblo Governor Raymond Loreto says he hopes the Learning Center will be open in less than a year. Native alumni at San Diego State University are speaking out to say they believe their university made a wrong decision. In 2019, SDSU had previously advised faculty members to include a land acknowledgement in their course syllabus. The school is located on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people. Then earlier this month, the University Senate reversed their policy. The new policy now gives faculty the option to include the land acknowledgement in syllabi instead of mandating it. Robert Levi Jr. is an SDSU alum who told ICT that acknowledging the ancestors of the land is the right thing to do.
Well, the land acknowledgement out here in California is basically, it's needed. So again, no one forgets that Indians, California Indians in particular, are still around. That we have influences in culture events and also in universities.
Those in opposition of the land acknowledgement argued that their First Amendment rights were being disregarded. A film camp for Lakota youth, that's the project filmmaker Jim Warren recently put on in South Dakota. Amor Montgomery reports.
Okay, sound, quiet on the set.
Scene, Amor, take 2.
Warren opened the day with an overview of his career in movies.
So, when you look up this big Lakota, what will you find?
He also talked about some key elements of storytelling.
Our traditional way of education was through storytelling. And when someone would ask a question, one of our young people, it would be turned into a story, and lead into the answer. And that process was critical thinking. That is traditional education that goes beyond, in my opinion, modern education.
Warren and his colleagues walked the students through some interview techniques. And what is one thing you would love to see change in the future?
One thing I hope to see in the future is today's generation build a better tomorrow.
I'd like to see us have more of an impact on the future, such as Bitcoin or Metaverse.
And had them help on filming a PSA announcement that will be used by the University of South Dakota Oyate Circle.
Now this is going to be probably televised.
The 7 students from Rapid City Central High School's Lakota Empowerment Club gathered for the day on the set of Warren's film Remembering the Children, about students who died at the Rapid City Indian boarding school. It was a comprehensive introduction to the industry.
One of my favorite things I learned today was sound systems within filming. I really liked listening and listening out for things that could have ruined the production. Sound is one of the most important things.
The day ended with an honoring song for the boarding school children. In Rapid City, South Dakota, this is Amor Montgomery for ICT.
Warren hopes the camp sparks an interest for Native youth in the future. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, allegations of collusion and environmental studies concerning the Dakota Access Pipeline, plus politics and recognizing Indigenous women in Canada. We'll be right back. On Tuesday, NDN Collective released a damning climate justice report on the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was the same day as World Water Day. The report is titled Faulty Infrastructure and the Impacts of the Dakota Access Pipeline. It lays out a detailed timeline of events focusing on 3 major areas. NDN Collective founder, president, and CEO Nick Tilson joins us. Hi, Nick. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, as I mentioned, this report focuses on 3 major areas. Tell us about those and what they mean.
One of the main ones is faulty infrastructure. So, the faulty infrastructure of the Dakota Access Pipeline is one of the things that is detrimental to the impacts on the environment here. The Dakota Access Pipeline Company, they weren't using the pipe they should use. They were using rusty pipe. They were a really, really sloppy company. And, because these pipeline companies, they're all about profit, right? So they're trying to, take a pathway to have as little amount of money being put into the pipeline as possible, because they're trying to make money off of it. So it's faulty infrastructure, from rusty pipelines to rusty screws to taking shortcuts, to even the pump stations were inadequate. So that's one area. The other area, one of the other big areas is also the lack of actual real mitigation plan. The lack of a mitigation plan that actually meets the level of the pipe itself. There's more oil going through the pipeline now than was projected at the time. And so there's not an adequate and accurate mitigation plan in place. Should the pipeline break and put 18 million people's water at risk, they don't have the ability to respond to it. That's the other thing. The next portion of this is also the reality that this entire process has been completely mismanaged by the US government and the Army Corps of Engineers. And that process after process that the Army Corps of Engineers has for projects like this were violated consistently from the very get-go of listening to the consultations of tribal nations, all the way to where they decided to put the pipeline to cross the Missouri River, to all of the lack of the environmental impact assessments and statements for the pipeline itself. And the Army Corps of Engineers violated their own laws and their own processes. And that's why today the Dakota Access Pipeline is operating without a permit right now, operating without a permit. And that's what this report lays out, all of these different components.
I'm really curious if you can share how this report was compiled. What kinds of sources were you using in terms of being able to make these findings?
There was a really awesome team put together, um, who actually started on the ground in Standing Rock, a tech team that was put together. And this tech team had all kinds of different experience. They had experience from, tribal governance, understanding of the treaties, understanding of the laws. Some of them also had experience in working on pipeline projects in Europe and other places. And so bringing in experts, right? Bringing in subject matter experts who have created mitigation plans, who have created infrastructure plans, taking their knowledge and applying it to this report and saying, compared to other pipelines around the world and other things, how does this one compare up? And the reality is Energy Transfer Partners and the Dakota Access Pipeline has a terrible track record. And to be clear, I don't think any big fossil fuel companies are good. And I think most of them are destructive. I think all of them are destructive and extractive. But this is the worst of the worst. They're sort of like the mechanic you don't take your car to, because they will always mess up and it'll come back worse. And so bringing these expert, we learned a lot about everything from the pressure in the pipeline, when X amount of gallons are going through it, to what the pump stations have to be based on elevations, based on temperatures, based on all of these different things. And so having these subject matter experts be able to bring their specific from the field expert knowledge to this was really important. Also, some of these experts often are the experts that provide information, to pipeline companies when they're going to environmental impact study processes. And we were able to access that information, and put it into a report, and then put this report out to the tribes and to the people so they can use it to advocate for themselves.
Nick, we only have about 1 minute left, but the other part of this report calls on the Biden administration to shut down and drain this pipeline. As in very short words, tell us why that's important for him to do.
This is important because Indigenous people rose up, and one of the Biden administration's goals, they have goals on climate change and combating climate change. They have goals on strengthening tribal sovereignty and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships with tribal governments. And this is an opportunity for the Biden administration to do both of those things, to make a decision to shut down a pipeline that is operating illegally without a permit, aligned with their climate goals, while at the same time honoring the self-determination, sovereignty, and trust responsibility to the Native nations in this country.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
As we continue to celebrate Women's History Month, we are featuring the Executive Director of the Ontario Native Women's Association. The organization, which is 50 years old, is the largest Indigenous women's organization in Canada. ONWA has several areas they focus on that include justice, health, housing, violence, and others. And for the last 6 years, Cora McGuire-Syrett has led the group. Welcome, Cora.
Oh, welcome. Thank you for having me today.
So tell us, what drives you to do this kind of work?
Oh, there's lots actually. I think it began with my ancestors and, my role models in my life were my grandparents, who were advocates of the movement back in, the 60s and the 70s and probably even prior to, right? And really, what they taught me was that not let my trauma define me. As they were residential school survivors, they never allowed that story to be their only story. And they always continued to advocate for Indigenous women. So, here in Canada, there's a lot of legal discrimination written into law. And so they've challenged it. And so I grew up in the movement, I guess you can say. And so just growing up, and that just becomes your life purpose, your life journey to leave a legacy behind for our children that is, a healthy and safer community for our children than the one that we grew up in, right? So, yes, that's pretty much kind of what kind of sums me up on what we do and why I do what I do. I love my community. I love, our culture. I love who we are as a people. And, it's an honor, and I'm humbled every day to be able to walk this journey.
As we continue this legacy that you're talking about, can you sort of characterize how you've been able to grow on one your 6 years that you've been leading the organization?
I would say dedication to an issue. And, I've realized a large amount of stubbornness to not take no for an answer. So when you're coming up against a barrier and, just don't take no for an answer, especially like when you're trying to address like critical issues such as, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which is all across North America, here in Canada and the US and all over the world, quite frankly. And being able to, one, continue to speak out against the issue because, we have a right to safety. We have a right to healing. And when you've kind of set up that focus of what is your vision as an agency and walk towards that vision, run towards that vision, jump over those barriers and don't let those barriers stop you because that's how we break down colonization.
When we're talking about the biggest threats to the development and the growth of Indigenous women in Canada, you've mentioned two topics, one being the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, and second, the residential schools. Would you say that there's other issues in addition to those? And can you talk more about that?
Oh, there's so many issues that it's, we're overrepresented in every kind of area, whether it be like the justice system, from child welfare, and but at a foundational level, what's really missing is the honor and acknowledgement of being a strong Indigenous woman and changing that story. I talk with my children and my daughters all the time, and they ask kind of what's being told about us as Indigenous women in the media, and we talk about how we're more than victims, we're more than survivors. We're leaders, we're we're gatherers, we're knowledge holders. We are like our children are our future generations, and so being able to reclaim our space, reclaim who we are, and be supported as a community, because you can measure the health and well-being of any community based on the health and well-being of women in that community, because when moms are healthy and well, the community is healthy and well because we're raising future generations of healthy leadership. And so I think our leadership is scary, I think, for colonial systems who have been able to benefit on the backs of these stories of, the crisis that we face as a community, as a nation, as Indigenous women all across North America. So I think being able to kind of stop and reclaim who we are. We are the experts on issues that we face. And so I think it's about reclaiming our leadership.
I want to ask the flip side to my other question, which is what are the success stories and the stories of resilience of Indigenous women in Canada? Are there any change makers who stand out to you right now, and who should we be kind of looking out for?
Oh my goodness, there's so many. I think right away, the youth of tomorrow, like the youth today in all of our communities are phenomenal. Like they stand bravely in the face of fear. And not only that, but also the women who are taking up their responsibilities as being parents and, changing that history of that legacy of intergenerational trauma. Like to me, it's like, I know we do have leaders, we do have change makers. And, we do have like political leaders, for instance, but also at the same time, I always am honored and really humbled by when we're supporting a mom who's got 5 children and she's able to be that mom. And when we're looking at, a family coming together and healing together, those are the real change makers every single day in every one of our communities. Every time somebody takes up their responsibility towards healing, they're making change for all of our future generations. And those are the women that I acknowledge and recognize every day, because they give me hope and inspiration to continue to fight the battle, to continue, like when you're coming up against so many barriers, it's seeing, a mom give birth to a baby and her whole community is supporting her. So I honor each of them every single day.
Well, Cora, thank you.
Make much.
U.S. Representative Don Young was first elected to Congress in 1973 after winning a special election. Before his death last week, Young became the longest-serving Republican in the history of Congress. And in his nearly 50 years of service, he has had significant accomplishments in Native communities. So what are those accomplishments? Joining us today is ICT regular contributor John Tsuda to break this down. Hi, John. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Elia. Great to be with you again, and very sad about the topic that we're talking today. But I'm glad that thanks for the opportunity to relate a little bit of my experience with Don Young and what a great guy he was.
Sure. Well, let's just jump right in. When we're talking about the contributions and the accomplishments that Representative Young had on Native communities, what's the first thing that stands out to you?
Well, I would say that he had a heart and he really cared for Native folks. He spent the vast majority of his life in Alaska among Native folks, was married for decades to a member of the Gwich'in Band, and really, took the Native community there in Alaska to be part of his life, and really reflected that, I think, in a way that we all appreciated, and that he would listen to them. And really, that was at the root of what was successful for him and successful for Indian country, was listening and hearing what the tribes wanted. And at the end of the day, he always said, I just want to do what's good for you.
Yeah, I mean, some people in Alaska, I was reading, have never known a congressman that wasn't Don Young. That's how long he was serving in Congress. I want to talk more about how he sort of institutionalized tribal sovereignty in Alaska. We've heard that time and time again from tribal leaders who said he's always asking, how are Alaska Native people fitting into conversations about policy? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And really, in some ways, I think part of the genius, and people sometimes think it's funny because Don was sort of personally could be gruff but jovial, but really he was very thoughtful in his approach, particularly on Native matters, and in Alaska, as we know, is very complicated. The history is complicated, and we have these overlapping laws, ANCSA, that came after allotment laws. It's very, very complicated. And so Don, I really think, became a master at trying to work through those various overlapping laws in ways that would benefit the Native communities. And again, at the root of all that, I think, was his desire to help the communities. And so, on the issue of sovereignty, he supported them, and he supported it probably as much out of sort of legal notions of sovereignty, but more out of the notion that that community knows what's best for them, and they ought to be able to ones to make those decisions and determinations for themselves. And that's, I would suspect, over the years, what really became to solidify him as a great champion of tribal sovereignty.
The other big contribution that he had was his role in supporting Secretary Deb Haaland to lead the Department of the Interior. When he stepped on board and said, I stand behind her, how big of a signal do you think that was to Republicans in particular, that this was a big deal?
Well, it was a big deal. Just say it flat out. In part because Don had been was around for so long, and it's interesting to say that what we would really think of as a modern frontiersman from Alaska, represented the best in Washington. But it's true. He really represented his state and brought those values to Washington. And one of those values is to look at the person, really, and move past the politics. And he really did that. He, of course, with his love for Native issues and Native people, appreciated Secretary Haaland when she was a colleague in the House, and worked hard to establish relationships with her from day one. and carried that forward. And I think, again, given his stature, he was able to step a little bit above the daily politics that are very rough and tumble and say, no, this is a good thing from a big picture level that we all need to support. And again, that speaks volumes about him as a person and as a leader in Congress.
John, I have just one last question. Now that he's passed away, of course, that leaves a vacancy for his seat in Congress. What do you think that vacancy will mean for Alaska Natives?
Unclear. There's a lot of political turmoil in Alaska at this point in time, just like there is in most of the country. And Alaska Native folks have really found their footing. The support they had from long-term members like Don. And so I think that they are better prepared now than they've ever been to voice their support. And it's entirely possible. There's a lot of great Native leaders in Alaska now who have experience. They've been leaders of corporations, community leaders. I think, and again, they're in the best position. There may be the next congressman come from those ranks. It's very, very possible there. That would be a great thing.
Well, John, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I am Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.